Welcome once again to the Images in Focus show. I'm Juan Pons, and with me, as always, is my good friend David Swindler. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great. How are you, Juan?
Excellent. And I'm excited because this is part 2 of Selecting Your Lenses show, where we talk all about all the different kinds of lenses and how to select the lenses that are going to work for you. So why don't we get to it? Why don't you go for it, David?
Yeah, so when I'm shooting in the outdoors, one of the things that I really pay a lot of attention to is flare control and Sunstar quality. And as Juan alluded to in the previous episode, we have these aperture blades within your lens. And the number of aperture blades and the design of those aperture blades, whether they're more straight edged or curved, is going to dictate the type of bokeh and Sunstar quality that you're going to get. So let's take a look at some examples here on this slide. I shot a couple different images, one with this Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter lens, and another with a Canon 16 to 35 millimeter lens, the f4 version. Both of these were shot at f22. And I shot that at f22 because I really wanted to get that specific diffraction effect with that nice Sunstar in the frame. Now, if I look at the Nikon 14 to 24, you can see here that we have all these little flare spots everywhere. So you can see that the flare on this particular lens is not really very well controlled. If you look at the Canon lens, you can see there's hardly any flare spots anywhere. And this lens has very good flare control when shooting directly into the light. And and I'll see this time and time again on workshops where someone will be shooting with a lens that has terrible flare control, and then someone next to them is getting like zero flare, and they're shooting the same thing. And so choice of lens is critical in that regard. But then the next thing is, what does the Sunstar or the diffraction pattern actually look like? And you can see here with this Nikon lens, it's not really all that sharp or distinct. We kind of have it's kind of breaking up into multiple bands here. Whereas with this Canon lens, it has a very symmetrical Sunstar, and, it's very sharp. And that's all going to depend on the type of aperture blades. If we look up here, for example, if we have just kind of a square opening in the lens, well, you're going to get like this square-looking diffraction effect. If we have a pentagon type of shape with these aperture blades and very sharp corners, that's when we're going to start getting this 10-pointed diffraction effect. And then, as you go through these different types, like let's say we have more rounded aperture blades, well, that's where you're going to get a less sharp of a Sunstar, and it's going to kind of be split apart into multiple bands, kind of like what you're seeing here with this Nikon lens. And if we were able to have like a perfectly circular lens, which is what you're going to get if you're shooting it wide open with no stopping down of the aperture blades, then you're going to get zero diffraction effect, and everything is going to be perfectly round. And that's going to be the consideration we take a look at when we talk about bokeh.
Right, and exactly. And then it's interesting though that we think about having multiple blades. Oftentimes we look at lenses and say, hey, we want lenses with the most aperture blades, right? Because it's going to give you the smoothest bokeh, which you're right, which you're going to talk about in a minute. But you're doing that at the expense of Sunstars, especially with those lenses that tout bladed curved blades, right? Which we're seeing some of those out there nowadays with the curved blades. I'm not sure why I'm transposing those two words, with the curved blades. And so typically, if you want good Sunstars, you do not want those curved blades, correct?
That's exactly right.
Cool.
And so moving on, let's talk about flare control. Now, flare is manifest in two ways. You can get this glare effect where either the detail is in the contrast is really washed out and you're getting a lot of unwanted light coming into the shadowy parts of the image, or you get these very obvious color casts where you get like a big area of red or green or something like that. The second way that flare is manifest is through visible artifacts. And these are caused by internal reflections within your lens. And typically, you're going to see these artifacts in the shape of the lens aperture. So if the lens aperture is kind of a pentagon type of shape, or you're going to see a lot of little pentagons all throughout your image. And, the quality lenses that you purchase, the manufacturer will often put a variety of lens coatings on the surface of that to try to cut down on the amount of internal reflections that we're going to get. If you look at this image over here, this was shot with a lens that has very poor flare control. And so you can see like these obvious artifacts coming in where you got these spots here. But look at these huge like hexagons that we have in the shape of the lens aperture. These are completely shot ruining. Yeah, so this is the kind of lens that I could not shoot directly into the light with. Whereas something else like that Canon 16 to 35 millimeter that I showed you, I can shoot into the light all day long and get very little flare as a result. Now, what are some of the best ways to control flare? Well, obviously buying a quality lens is paramount. But the second thing to look at is make sure you always use that lens hood. I'm a stickler when it comes to lens hoods. Every time I shoot, that lens hood is on. Because for me, that's how I protect my lens. And it also keeps out all that side light and the stuff that can reduce contrast in my image. The second thing is you remove filters. If I'm shooting into the light, I want to cut down those internal reflections that are going on. If I have a filter between the front of my lens, well, guess what? Now I got more surfaces for that light to bounce off of. And then the third thing is just shoot when the light is softer. Wait for that sun to kind of just hit the very edge of that horizon and then shoot into the light. You're going to find you get a lot less flare when the light is not so harsh.
And the other thing really is to pay attention also to the light that's hitting your lens, right? So that if you have, especially when the sun is nice and low, you may have a really strong light hitting the front end of your lens. And that's going to bring out all sorts of issues, from flare to dust that's on the lens and whatnot. But one of the things you can do, if you're able to, if you're not shooting too wide, is actually block that light from hitting the lens straight on. Obviously, that means you're not shooting straight into the sun. That means you're shooting kind of to the side of the sun. But if you just put your hand out and block that light from hitting your lens without having your hand in the picture, that's going to do away with a lot of that flare. So there's something else to consider and do when you're out in the field.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. So now let's move on to bokeh. Bokeh is actually an English transliteration of the Japanese word, which means blur.
Right.
And it's come to mean like the aesthetic quality of the out of focus areas in your image.
Or the creaminess, as I like to say, the creaminess of that background.
Yeah, just the creaminess and just how good it looks. And it's a very important consideration if you like shooting with that very shallow depth of field. Which portrait shooters really love, wildlife shooters really love, because it helps really simplify your compositions and bring your subject to the forefront. Now, generally speaking, having more blades in your lens, more aperture blades, and a more rounded shape to those blades is going to give you better bokeh. But, as we talked about as well, that can also mean a worse Sunstar quality. So you really can't have a lens that has the best bokeh and the best Sunstar. It just doesn't exist.
Right.
You have to pick one or the other. And you can see that here in this illustration here. With 3 blades, you're going to get like this crappy looking triangle bokeh, which, well, maybe you like that for creative effect. If you have 5 blades, this is probably a great lens for a Sunstar, but that out of focus quality is not so attractive. But when you have like 12 blades, now it starts to get that nice creamy rounded look to it.
Yeah, the good thing is, oftentimes for the bokeh, we're looking almost for longer lenses, right? Versus for the Sunstars, we're looking at the shorter lenses. There's kind of an overlap there in the middle of the focal range. But in general terms, it's okay, to look at those 2 different qualities in the different focal lengths.
Exactly. So now let's move on to chromatic aberration. And chromatic aberration occurs when light is split into different colored wavelengths. And when it comes to the focal plane, they're not all focusing at the same point. And so that's going to cause this fringing to occur where you can get like magenta fringes, white fringes, green or purple fringes. And you're often going to see that on high contrast boundaries. So example, we have like a mountain range. Well, the mountain range is dark, the sky is really bright behind it. Well, that's where you're really going to notice your chromatic aberration. So here's a shot that I took, of a mountain range in Alaska, and I'm zooming in here because with chromatic aberration, you have to zoom in a ways to be able to see it. And so this is what it looked like uncorrected. And you can see here we have this nice, thick magenta fringe running on the left or the right sides of these mountain peaks. And you see a little bit of a green fringing going on the opposite side over here. Now, when I take it into Lightroom and hit the correct chromatic aberration, which is something you should do on every single image, you can see it takes a lot of that away. It's not perfect, the edge still isn't completely sharp because of the chromatic aberration, but at least that annoying color isn't there. So selecting a lens that has good chromatic aberration control is important, especially if you want that really sharp edge detail on high contrast boundaries.
Yeah, and this is one of those areas where, again, quality matters and cost is going to matter too, because in order to correct for these in the lens, it means a number of different things. It means different coatings on the elements inside, and oftentimes means more elements inside the lens, because that's what those elements are doing, is realigning, as you're seeing in that graphic, realigning the colors of the light. So they're kind of more parallel to each other, not broken up as they are. So that's when the money, the cost and the expense of a good lens comes into play.
Exactly. All right, so now let's talk about chroma and optical aberrations. And basically, what is an aberration? It's just an imperfection in the way the lens is focusing the light. And there's a whole host of aberrations out there. You don't have to be so concerned about exactly which ones are which, but this is kind of a handy little graphic here where let's say we're photographing stars in the night sky. That's one of the easiest places to see these aberrations. And if you're an astrophotographer, you're probably going to care a lot about aberrations. If you're like a portrait photographer, you're probably not going to care as much. And so with no aberration, we've got distinct point sources. With chromatic aberration, you start seeing it split into the different color wavelengths, like this. If you have spherical aberrations, you're going to start seeing it expanding outward very symmetrically, and it's not going to be as sharp and crisp as it should be. With chroma, it begins to become more one-sided, where you start seeing the spherical, it's kind of like a one-sided spherical aberration in a way. And then we have like astigmatism. You hear about people with vision problems having astigmatism. Well, guess what? Lenses have astigmatism too. And you have tangential and sagittal astigmatism depending on what direction it's happening in. And then you get combinations of these aberrations like chroma plus astigmatism. And that's what can lead to things like these big triangle-shaped stars that you can see like up in the corners of your image. Now these aberrations are not uniform across your field of view. As you can see from this test on the Canon 24mm lens done by my good friend Royce Baer, at f1.4 in the center, the aberrations are fairly well controlled. You see some spherical aberration, of course, going on. As we go midway into the frame, you start seeing some of this triangle-shaped chroma appearing. And then as we go to the very edge, we get these like bird-like stars, these big old long triangles. And that's like a combination of chroma and astigmatism. But as we stop this lens down and we go to like f2.8, for example, now look, that chroma and astigmatism becomes much better controlled. And that's one thing that you're going to find with a lot of these lenses. The aberrations can be very pronounced when you're on either end of the range, if you're wide open or if you're very stopped down. But when you're in that middle range, you're going to see a lot fewer of these optical aberrations showing up. And that includes things like vignetting.
Now, we talked about, you talk about chroma, and chroma is something that is definitely important when you're shooting astrophotography, but it really isn't as big an issue in all other types of photography because it's going to show in very small point sources of light, right? But even like, if you're shooting, let's say, for example, at a wedding and you have some little lights in the background Christmas lights and whatnot, you're not going to see that coma kind of appear in those kind of situations, because that's going to be more the aperture issues or the that you're going to see in those point source of light. Correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's going to be more controlled by like your bokeh
Right.
and, how pleasing the bokeh is versus necessarily these optical aberrations.
Right. So that's why, this is really, especially coma, all these other things may be different. Astigmatism may be different in other kind of situations where you're shooting, for example, high magnification macro work or even scientific work. Some of those things may come into play, but for the most cases, these are very fringe issues to deal with, very specific to people that specialize in one specific thing.
Exactly. So that's why selecting a lens is very dependent on what you intend to use it for.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about vignetting. So I have the Sony 24 to 105 millimeter lens, which I think is a great kind of focal range. I love, just how multi-purpose it can be. But one thing I hate about it is that it has very bad vignetting, just native vignetting at 24 millimeter. Hit the wide open.
Yes, it does. Yes.
And so here is a raw file that I just took off that lens at 24 millimeter. And you can see here just how bad that vignetting is up here in these corners. So if I take that raw file into Lightroom and I say remove the lens vignette, well, this is what I get. Yeah, it removes some of it, but you can still see that there's still some there. The only way I can really get a more satisfactory result is in Lightroom. I have to come in and remove the vignette and the distortion. And then that means I might lose some of my field of view as well. So if you're maintaining that full field of view is really important, then maybe this particular lens at 24 millimeter isn't the right choice for you. So again, it's all about trade-offs. It's all about what do I need for the work that I am doing.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we said earlier on, I think on the first episode, right, is that, lenses, will perform differently at different focal lengths. Here at 24, the 24-105 at 24 is not the best. I would rather, in a situation like that, use the 16-35 and shoot at 24, because I'm going to get better quality than using the 24-105 at 24. But if I use that same lens and I'm shooting at 100, it's going to be a beautiful lens, really sharp. You're not going to have any of these sort of issues that we're seeing now with shooting wide.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so let's talk a little bit now about image quality. As I mentioned on the previous episode, sharpness can and will fall off at the really wide open apertures and when you have the more stopped down apertures. And as Juan said, generally the sharpest place for your lens is about 2 or maybe sometimes 3 stops below the maximum aperture. So if we look at this chart over here, the red line is resolution, the blue line is sharpness. And over here on the left side, this is the MTF, which is a very technical term, the modular transform function. We're not going to go into details on what that means, but if it's something that interests you, you can do a lot more research on that. But basically, it's just a measure of sharpness or acuity. And so if we take this particular lens here, at f4.8, well, you can see the sharpness in the resolution has taken a nosedive down. That's typically what will happen with a lot of lenses at completely wide open apertures. There's some that don't really have much of a fall off at that wide open aperture, and that's a lens that I would choose, for shooting like my wildlife and my portraits and things like that. As we begin to stop that down, you can see here now we've improved, our resolution is much better. But if we start stopping down too far, like to your f22 or even beyond, now we become diffraction limited, and our sharpness is going to fall off quite dramatically.
Yeah, we run into that quite a bit. People wanting to get the maximum sharpness image, and you see them stopping down to f20 or f22, and you're like, no, don't do that, because it's going to affect the sharpness in your image.
It definitely will. And the thing is they think, oh, I'm getting better depth of field by stopping down more. But the thing is the depth of field that you theoretically gain is is basically impacted by the diffraction softening. And the diffraction effect becomes dominant at some point. And so you just kind of have to know your lens, you have to know your camera, and all those variables come into play. The next thing that I look at is center versus edge or corner sharpness. And some of these newer lenses are coming out with, they have excellent edge and corner sharpness. Some of the older lenses that I've used have had terrible edge and corner sharpness. And again, this variable that we talked about, this MTF, that's what they're going to use, to kind of show you how much sharpness fall off you're going to get, from the center of the image out to the edge of that image. And so, if that matters to you, learn how to read those MTF charts, especially when you're looking at the very technical reviews on lenses. And that brings up a good point here. We have people that go out and do these bench testing in the laboratory. And it's very scientific. They have these great charts, these great graphics. You can see exactly how one lens compares to another. That is a great tool if you do want to compare one lens to another. But in reality, what matters the most is how does this lens perform in the real world? Right. What do the Sunstars look like when you take it out and shoot a landscape with it? Does that little bit of edge sharpness matter, if I'm only going to be shooting wildlife with this lens? Well, it's probably not. If I'm going to be shooting landscapes or astrophotography with that lens, then I'm probably going to care a lot more about how sharp my edges and corners are.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point because, a lens that performs well in a bench test is not necessarily going to perform well in the real world, especially in the type of photography that you're doing compared to a bench test. So if a bench test may show you this lens is super sharp, but then let's say, for example, you take it on the field and that lens that's super, super sharp, the sharpest lens you can get, doesn't have image stabilization and you're shooting handheld. Well, guess what? All that sharpness in the world doesn't do you any good if you're hand holding a lens at too slow of a shutter speed because the light is low and you're going to get motion blur in the scene. So it may not work from that instance. Or the autofocus may not be, maybe very slow for that particular lens and you're relying more on a fast autofocus because you're shooting fast moving subjects. So bench tests are good reference points, but nothing compares to real world testing. Especially real world testing done by you, the way that you shoot and, how does that lens match your expectations? There's nothing that compares to that.
Well, everyone, that concludes the second part of our series on selecting your lenses. We hope you found this information useful. And if you did, make sure that you hit like and share with your friends. Make sure you join us on the Images in Focus Facebook group. It's an interactive community we have where you can post images for critique and also ask questions to the community. Thanks for joining in, and make sure you stay tuned for our next and final episode in the Selecting Your Lens series.